Here we go. This book chapter reading is from the book Physical Disability and Sexuality Stories from South Africa, edited by X Hunt. In this book, there's a variety of stories that are captured from a research study. And what I like about this book that it provides a variety of definitions from sexuality to disabilities to femininity, masculinities, etc. And it captures a woman who had to reimagine her sexuality within the context of femininity and becoming disabled. This image shows a woman clutching her bra at the back by her thumb. It's a very sexy and sultry photo while she's on her wheelchair. In another story, a man recalls events of sexual encounters with women leading up to his current partner and had to reimagine fatherhood in the context of disability and how has this evolved. The images that are captured in his chapter are that of his partner who was pregnant at the time, as well as one of the pictures, which is a portrait of himself and one of the sons looking sweetly in each other's eyes. This book chapter reading focuses on Bongani's story, who looks into aspects of disabled men being viewed less than non-disabled men. Reflections. When it comes to my masculinity, as a Black South African Zulu man with physical disability, who is also a student of disability studies, I need to talk about two things. I need to address my culture, how I was raised, and how this shaped my non-academic experience of sexuality. But I also need to address how, as a student of social studies, I experience and engage with that literature which I have encountered on the subject of masculinity in the context of physical disability. I wish I could say there is no fantasy, imagination, or expectation with influences of sex and sexual relations with ourselves and with others. But again, without these forces, how does sexuality become an enjoyable part of living and loving? The reason I raise the issue of expectations, fantasies, and ideals is that no matter how open-minded, unbiased, and objective one tries to be, we all bring these unconscious elements with us when we are getting together with people, especially for the first time. Will I give her everything she needs? I hope that when we're done, she's pleased. I hope it's everything you thought it'd be. Oh. Surprisingly, perhaps these are lyrics by the famous R&B singer Trey Songz, who is considered a sex symbol in many ways. You'll notice that there are elements of self-doubt and timidity in these lyrics. My aim in quoting them is to illustrate that if such negative thoughts can affect a famous musician with high status and the supposed ability to attract any woman he wants to, it's only natural that these feelings would be present in all men. In addition, I am deliberately making a musical reference because in my younger and more impressionable years, music and movies provided a window into the intricacies of love and relationships. If I'm going to be completely honest, I should add that while life has left me with a more pragmatic outlook on love and sex, it would be a lie if I said all those images of perfect romance and fantasy, which I encountered in the media I enjoyed, have completely disappeared from my mind. Us versus them, a small piece of my personal story. Our upbringing has an enormous effect on the way we turn out as adults. Due to the injury that led to my paralysis at 4 years old, my parents made a decision to admit me in the so-called special school for children with disabilities. Now, we can probably all agree that's rather an early age to be away from the comforts and amenities of one's home, especially when it happens in the context of a newly acquired paraplegic status. Don't get me wrong, I was extremely lucky to be in the school where I could access the best possible rehabilitation given the traumatic event I had been through, losing the use of my lower limbs. But in order to get this help, I now had to be away from home, staying with a bunch of strangers. The rehabilitation process was aided by having access to occupational therapists and physiotherapists, psychologists, teachers, and caregivers that seemed to fully understand my needs for accommodation. In addition, the layout of the school was completely accessible. It is a very supportive environment. It was an environment marked by many of the normal naughtinesses of school years. Just like any kid, my peers and I at school also got up to no good. My friends and I once got into trouble for being found in a girls' hostel. There was no such thing as visiting hours. The school was designed for boys to live in their own space and girls to live in their own. So basically, we had broken the rules. If truth be told, I was asking a girl out, but her friends decided to rat on me. Can you believe it? We were punished and were told that we could not see each other. She had just read Romeo and Juliet or seen one of those young person with rebellious against the world type of movies. So we continued to see each other despite the house mothers saying we should separate. How's that for young love? In our school, we participated in everything that mainstream schools did, like sports and music, and we also took excursions so that we could get to experience the outside world every now and again. That's where I think some of my insecurities first arose. By that I mean to say it was clear to see that when I was out in the world in groups along with schoolmates, the way people would stare at us would make it absolutely clear that they had never seen such a large group of children with disabilities. I never really understood this because from the point of view of me as a child who had been exposed to disability and kids with disabilities from a very early age, I assumed that an adult would have at some point been exposed to that as well. I think that is what led to a deeply rooted sense of inferiority that developed amongst most of us when it came to mainstream society and feeling left out. We were like fish out of water when we were not within the confines or gates of our school. Our experience of the outside world came primarily through the school excursions, our time away on holidays, TV, and music. I think every school has that cool group that always seemed to know everything that the larger group of kids didn't know much about. I remember in our group of friends, there was one of the boys who always had the coolest clothes, had more non-disabled friends that he hung out with during holidays, knew all the movies before most of us saw them, and of course, had more experience with girls. I remember clearly this one time when we came back from holidays and his friend of ours, I don't want to say his real name, but let's call him Cyril. He told his story in a very colorful manner and was proud of himself. Between you and me, I think he added not just extra salt to the story, but a few spices from very far away. But hey, we were just a bunch of teenagers who didn't know any better. So we just accepted the story. Now, the point of the story is that Cyril had apparently hooked up with a non-disabled girl, while the rest of us were still caught up dating within the scope of girls we found ourselves with at that school. To us, though, it is hard to admit it. We saw non-disabled girls to be more of a prize than the girls with disabilities. That is where my internalized prejudice regarding disability emerged. It was largely based on the issue of us, the children with disabilities, versus the kids of the bigger world that were without disabilities. To have any relationship with a non-disabled person was seen as an achievement because we saw that as breaking the mold and out of the norm of your equal being another person with disabilities, just like you. We viewed non-disabled people as superior to us, even on a friendly level, and being in a relationship with them was a bigger feat to achieve. I clearly remember that if a girl with a disability was dating a non-disabled boy from the outside world, she was immediately seen as being out of our league, despite her having a disability just like us. We knew just from that we stood no chance as boys with disabilities. Besides, which wheelchair user would stand a chance? So anyway, right? I used to think. I will come back to discuss how such a view of the outside world informed my identity, disposition, and attitudes towards women when I eventually left school and integrated into mainstream society. However, it was with all these experiences in mind and my recollections of time at a special school at the fall that I took the following photo. In the picture below is an area of my new university home, which is accessible to me. However, not all spaces in the world outside of a special school are accessible. These physical spaces are a metaphor for my feelings regarding dating and relationships in the terrain of a segregated school and in the outside world, respectively. The outside world being fraught with inaccessibility. That's the image. This is an area in a university residence which is flat and accessible. The image represents a symbol of accessibility aside from what I was exposed to back in my special school. Spaces communicate. They are able to tell you who is welcome and who is not. Photo by Bongani Mapumulo. There is another aspect that added to my feeling of being inferior as a man with a physical disability. Reflecting upon my own upbringing amongst men in my surroundings, gender roles are quite definitive of a place a person has in society. The culture I belong to is Zulu. I know there is no one definitive experience of a culture, but for the purposes of an understanding of my life, I will represent my experience of being Zulu. My family comes from an area called Umbumbulu, a rural area situated in the south of Durban in the KwaZulu-Natal province of South Africa. In Zulu culture, as I experienced it, it is almost as if by virtue of being male, one is already perceived to have leadership qualities. A herdship is something of a birthright. With such a birthright, one is expected to embrace and accept the responsibility of being a man, and therefore a leader irrespective of whether one has physical prowess. Physical prowess, however, is something that I, as a man with disability, often battled. So, broadly, that is my position as I write this piece, personally, as it were. My upbringing and my culture both influenced how I came to experience having a disability and how I saw this experience in relation to what I witnessed amongst non-disabled people and what I saw in broader society. However, beyond my personal reflections on my experiences of physical disability, I am also coming into a phase of my life as a student of social studies and disability scholarship, where I am beginning to engage with academic ideas and research about disabled masculinity, how I think about masculinity in the context of disability. Men's bodies have always had to submit to characteristics such as strength, potency, and physical disability. And here, Bongani references Cornell 1995 and Morris 1991. It goes even further by asserting that a social definition of masculinity is inextricably bound with the celebration of strength, of perfect bodies, and to be masculine is not to be vulnerable. It is also linked to a celebration of youth and of taking bodily functions for granted. Disability is often seen to be antithetical to this, a perception fueled and strengthened by the portrayal of disability in movies as involving weakness, dependency, and frailty. A typical portrayal is of a man who loses his masculinity due to some form of impairment. Such frailty can be in the form of impotency and the struggle to adjust to it. A movie most people would have watched is Avatar, where there is a lot of military activity. In this movie, disability is portrayed as incompatible with masculinity through the character of Jake Sully, who is not only the physical but also the psychological inferior of his twin brother, who is a man without disability. And of course, in Me Before You, the character of Will Traynor, paralyzed from the neck down, would rather die than face the reality of not being able to satisfy a woman sexually due to his disability. The movie's plots are a bit more complicated than that, to be fair, but the dominant narrative in the above-mentioned movies is that disability and the main features of masculinity cannot coexist. While I cannot personally relate to the way men who acquire a physical disability in their adult years struggle to adjust to their male sexuality, Murphy, 1987, describes the issue of sexual dysfunction in men akin to being emasculated and effectively castrated. He says that the emphasis many people place on erectile failure is linked to the incorrect view that all sex, by definition, penetrative, when in reality, sexual and emotional relationships offer a much wider range of expression. According to Tifa 1995, such an issue further strengthens the idea that normative sex for men is and has always closely been linked to the patriarchal and heterosexual ideology rather than to the broader and less restrictive ideas about sex and sexuality. Sexual pleasure does not emanate solely from penetration, and there are opportunities to look into more diverse experimentations and alternative techniques to encounter and experience pleasure and intimacy. For me personally, learning about how much broader sex can be than just penetration is important. For most of my life, like many other people, was also fixated upon the idea of reaching sexual satisfaction by means of penetration and no other way. I attribute this to the information and influence that I was exposed to from my earlier ages. This narrow view of sex led me to a state of utter confusion and internal conflict. To make matters worse, I thought of any possible non-disabled sexual partner as by definition superior to me. My role with such a partner would, I thought, have to be submissive, and hence in conflict with what I had learned about what it means to be a man. I had, in short, a view of myself as an outsider in the broader scope of sexual participation. Someone who was meant to be dominant but would always, by virtue of social status, have to be submissive. I felt like an other in the sense that people with disabilities are excluded from the male identity, which relies on superiority and negation from vulnerability. An example of this othering process from a different area of society would be the way white heterosexual men view themselves in opposition to women, black people, and gay men. The way I came to understand society and these different identities and their others was that male heterosexual men were at the top of the hierarchy. This left me with a single horrible question. Where could I find a place of pride for myself as a black man with a disability? I don't like admitting to having had these views, and I don't believe in them anymore. But, like all of us, I was deeply affected by the world I grew up in and the values it imparted. Well, now that we got that part, my current understanding of the theory out of the way, I bet you are asking yourselves whether I have restricted myself to dating only other people with physical disabilities, just like how things were at boarding school. I would say that things have rather changed since then. Firstly, I can admit that after leaving school, the dating pool shrunk quite drastically, and predictably so. So, I had to spread my wings in other directions. Secondly, just like the famous singer I mentioned above, I have also become a bit of a sex symbol myself, just with less money and fame. With that, I'm actually referring to the state of mind rather than a physical one. You might say that's a rather arrogant and presumptuous of me, and I'd agree with you, except for the fact that as much as I had never seen myself as appealing, attractive, and all of that, the most unpredictable things have happened. I don't exactly know what to attribute this to, but being on the periphery or fringes of society has assisted me to understand and make sense of the world from a particular standpoint, and this has benefited me romantically. Now, I have no idea what it is like for non-disabled men experiencing confidence and insecurity related challenges as they grow up. In my case, though, I clearly remember my watershed moment. I want to refer to what a participant alluded to during a research project carried out by Gershink and Miller, 1995. Eddie, one of the participants, made a comparison of himself as a man with a disability with women's experiences. He said, looking at himself in the mirror, in this context, it is important to observe that people with disabilities often experience the unwanted in attentions, intrusions, and stares with which women without disabilities are familiar. Eddie is heterosexual, working class men, and with spina bifida, who experiences a particular conflict in his way of navigating masculinity in the context of disability. Without getting into the intricate details of his utterances, the main idea from what he says is that he and men with disabilities in general do not automatically enjoy the power and privileges of men without disability and cannot be assumed to have access to the same physical resources. Essentially, he suffers from a form of sexual oppression as a man with a disability and therefore sees himself first and foremost as a man with disability, rather than a heterosexual man. There is rather complex issue of the hierarchy of identity politics here. He has something in common with women, a second-class status in society's eyes compared to heterosexual men. I can completely relate to the above narrative by Eddie. Out of school and into mainstream society, I carried severe insecurities and deemed myself as inferior to my non disabled peers. While I cannot deny that a majority of such perceptions and my self image crisis were internal, many can also be attributed to the experience of the mainstream social gaze and the baggage that is attached to it. One is never really sure of the origin of such gazes, whether they are from a genuinely sincere and compassionate place, or simply from a person's need for satisfaction of their curiosity about the other. Yet, with all the baggage of the gaze, my watershed moment came at the end of a curious woman's gaze, albeit achieved at the cost of surprisingly honest and vulnerability on her part. There was a coffee shop that I used to frequent during my lunch breaks. There was a woman who always used to take her break at the same time as me. There was nothing much to our relationship except the few and far between casual exchanges would make to each other. However, I remember one particular day when the coffee shop was full of patrons and all of the tables were full, that I happened to be by myself at my table. She scanned the room for some open space, realized that the only possible space would be at my table, and headed straight to my table with her drink. I imagined she was going to wait for her meal to be delivered at my table. Now, you're probably thinking I saw this as my lucky day. Hell no. I got really anxious and started panicking. But at the back of my mind, I was thinking, as soon as her food arrives, she'll leave me in peace to deal with my wimpish and meek tendencies. But she did nothing of the sort. She decided to have her meal at the table with me. I honestly cannot remember the details of that conversation, but it lasted the entire duration of our lunch break. To cut the long story short, from that day we started to see more of each other and even took our conversations to other places besides the usual coffee shop. I would love to better describe how expressive and direct this woman was, but I think that would need its own chapter. Let me just say it was my first experience of an assertive, dominant, and open minded person who definitely took note of my shy, inward disposition, but was still able to immerse herself into a world we both did not really understand. Somehow, she was able to extract and liberate the inner man concealed behind layers and layers of my so called inferior masculinity in context of disability. Now, retrospectively, I can admit there was a whole degree of problematic objectification that took place in that experience. As such, I don't assume that later in my life I would have found the same relationship fulfilling. However, for me, at that time of my life, given the number of confusing gazes and feedback I had been receiving up until that point, particularly from the opposite gender, this experience served a specific purpose. I grew to embrace the mirror reflections of myself a bit more, understood that societal projections are not always negative, but even when they are, one still can exercise one's own agency in how to deal with them. Lastly, I learned that others, at times, will be able to see the positive in me, that which you are not able to admit to yourself because you are too caught up in the negative self imposed perceptions. Most importantly, it normalized relationships for me. Some will be good, some will be bad, some will just be normal, with good and bad in them. But being a man with a physical disability doesn't make me feel more or less likely to have any of these experiences. It does not make me more or less of a partner or more or less of a man.